Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Liu Xin. In this series, we dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to my guests to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. So join me in real time by sending us your comments or questions via the CGTN page on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube or Weibo. If you're watching this live on the CGTN application, email me at thepointwithlx@cgtn.com. Let me know what you think. We air Headline Buster on Fridays at 11 a.m. Beijing time, so do get in touch and we just might read out your comments. Today, we're looking at China's major milestone, the ceremony marking the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. What key messages did China deliver on the occasion, and how are international media interpreting them? Before we delve in, a bit of background, of course. July the 1st was the big day. At the ceremony marking the centenary, Chinese President Xi Jinping, who is also General Secretary of the CPC, delivered a live speech from Beijing's iconic Tiananmen Square before a crowd of some 70,000 guests. The ceremony also featured a chorus, a fly-past of fighter jets and helicopters, a 100-gun salute, and a flag-raising ceremony. The ceremony provided a moment to look back and reflect. 100 years ago, when the CPC was founded in 1921, it had just over 50 members. Today, it has more than 95 million members, one of the largest political parties in the world. In his speech at the ceremony, President Xi Jinping looked back on many of China's achievements under the leadership of the party on the way to realizing the Chinese dream, that is, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. I can give you many numbers, but I have done that so many times already. Instead, I want to highlight some new expressions in Mr. Xi's speech. For the very first time in public, he described the past century in terms of 4 periods, and I think it is useful to help us understand what China really went through. First, from 1921, when the party was established, to 1949, when the People's Republic was founded. The party led the Chinese people to win the war against Japanese aggressors and the War of Liberation, or what is also known as China's Civil War. On October 1st, 1949, at the same Tiananmen Square, Chairman Mao Zedong famously declared that the Chinese people have stood up. The second period lasted from 1949 to 1978, the first 3 decades of the People's Republic. The CPC led the Chinese people in the most extensive and profound social changes in contemporary Chinese history. China transformed from a poor and backward country with 540 million people into a socialist country with 960 million. It was also during this period of time that China resisted armed provocation led by the US in what is called the Korean War. The third period was from 1978 to 2012, when the 18th Party National Congress was held, known as the era of reform and opening up and socialist modernization. In 35 years' time, China transformed itself from a highly centralized planned economy to a socialist market economy. In his speech, President Xi said reform and opening up was a crucial move in making China what it is today. China caught up with the times. Finally, from 2012 up to now, China entered what Mr. Xi calls a new era. It eliminated absolute poverty, effectively controlled the COVID-19 pandemic, and continued to reform and open up while advocating for a community with a shared future for mankind. China not only stood up but became prosperous and strong along the way. China's rejuvenation has become a historical inevitability. Of course, President Xi also looked ahead. To create a bright future, he touched upon 9 points to keep in mind. For instance, upholding the firm leadership of the party, uniting and working with the people, sticking to a Chinese path to modernization, and strengthening national defense and the armed forces, among others. He also talked about the confidence and resilience of the Chinese people. In the hour-long speech, there was one paragraph that captured the imagination of media around the world.
中国人民 We have never bullied, oppressed, or subjugated the people of any other country. And we never will. By the same token, we will never allow any foreign force to bully, oppress, or subjugate us. Anyone who would attempt to do so will find themselves on a collision course with a great wall of steel forged by over 1.4 billion Chinese people.
I think most countries around the world would share the same principles, wouldn't they? So development, peace, pride. On an occasion such as this one, the messages resonated with the Chinese people. It's important to note that President Xi's speech was met with wide attention and much enthusiasm. On China's Twitter-like Sina Weibo, over 20 of the top trending topics on July the 1st related to the CPC centenary. The hashtag CPC centenary received 10.8 billion views, setting a new record. By contrast, when you look at the international media, how have they covered the speech and ceremony? Before we get into some specific examples, we did a word bubble analysis. We rounded up 112 articles from 19 media organizations across 10 countries and eliminated the words China, Chinese, centenary, Xi Jinping and party to avoid repetition. Between the dates June the 30th and July the 2nd, here's what we got. You can see from most of the headlines, the most frequently mentioned words relate to bullying, followed by celebrating. Hong Kong, for instance, also made an appearance. If you look at the speech itself, however, words like people and development appear many more times. In the Chinese version, for instance, the word people was mentioned 86 times, whereas words related to bullying only occurred 3 times. So are the international headlines representative of the true content of the speech? In the articles of these media reports, the international media talked mostly about China reacting strongly if it feels bullied, but they pretty much ignored 2 other actions that President Xi mentioned: oppress and subjugate. So by singling out bullying without mentioning the other 2, which is oppress and subjugate, which are far more serious, the text makes it seem as if China is overreacting or being overly defensive. So that's the big picture. Now let's take a look at some specific examples. My first example comes from the New York Times. The headline goes, marking party's centennial, Xi warns that China will not be bullied. The article is particularly colorful in its language and rendition. In its report on President Xi's speech and China's ceremony, presumably to give people an understanding of what is going on, here's what the article says. A century after the Communist Party's founding, China's leader said foreign powers would crack their heads and spill blood if they try to stop its rise. Now listen to the adjectives used in these parts: pugnacious comment, strident words, bellicose rhetoric. I mean, given the proliferation of such vivid adjectives, the article almost reads more like a novel than something that should appear in a newspaper. As if to enhance the drama, the article describes a scene from the speech like this. Rumbles of distant thunder punctuated Mr. Xi's remarks, and dozens of large red Chinese flags hoisted around the square flapped noisily in the wind. The article makes it sound like the Chinese leadership is even able to set the pace for the thunder. And of course, the flags are red. That's the color of the national flag of China, and they are flapping noisily because it was windy and it was outside. To be fair, the article did relegate a paragraph to some of the achievements China holds dear. Toward the end, it says, President Xi highlighted the country's achievements since he took office in 2012, eradicating poverty, achieving greater economic prosperity, and building a strong military. That's nice, but then the article follows those examples like with this line. He used his long-term catchphrase, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, 21 times, as if it's wrong to mention these goals. As I said earlier, most international media jumped on the bullying note in the headlines and whole report, adding their own flourishes to the speech and event. Almost nowhere in these articles was there any mention of the key themes of cooperation, peace, development, young people, or the future. Why did this bullying part of the speech overshadow so many other aspects? I will leave that to the readers to figure out. Whatever the reason, however, that sentence was not what the whole speech was all about. Well, in a sea of alarmist headlines about the ceremony and Mr. Xi's speech, a few exceptions stood out. One South China Morning Post article, for example, focused on a different angle. The headline reads, Xi Jinping tries to build symbolic bridge between past and future at Chinese Communist Party centenary. The article says Chinese President Xi Jinping paid special tribute to his predecessors and revolutionary leaders in his speech to mark the Communist Party centenary, as he urged the younger generation to follow the party in pursuit of the dream of national rejuvenation. The article includes Xi's praise for previous leaders of China, as well as his appeal to young people to follow in their footsteps and live up to the party's expectations. It features another section of his speech that goes like this: "The future belongs to the young people, and our hopes also rest with them." It's refreshing to see an article that features a different angle from the ceremony and speech, one that looks backward and forward. So now that the Communist Party of China passed its 100-year milestone, what to expect for the next 100 years? I'll talk to my guests after the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Headline Buster. I'm pleased to be joined by three guests. They are Professor Josef Mahoney from East China Normal University. He's joining us from the United States. Ian Goodrum, senior editor and columnist at the China Daily. And last but not least, chief reporter from the Global Times, Wang Cong. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. We're still reeling from the entire celebration. As I mentioned, you know, the international reaction to the whole speech, to the ceremony on July the 1st, pretty much centered around the word bully. Is this surprising? And Professor Mahoney, is this surprising to you? And why do you think this word struck such a raw nerve among some, especially in Western countries?
You know, President Xi has a sophisticated communication style. China is a large country with many different interest groups, and it's incumbent on him to speak to all of them, including those who are particularly concerned about historical bullying and that which has continued more recently. The problem is that aside from a couple of well-known minority groups and regions, most in the West reductively view China and its political system as monoliths. Consequently, they're unable to hear nuances or different messages addressed to different groups of people, messages that sometimes emphasize different and even competing values and initiatives. Furthermore, they're inclined to see the Chinese political system as both illegitimate and as a threat, as the bully at home and abroad. And this kind of discourse, as we know, accelerated especially during the Trump years. Now, this explains why they listen, especially for words like bullying, to reinforce their prejudices and criticisms and ignore positive messages like calls for cooperation that give a different or fuller picture. This is why the subtext of some international reporting verges on irony and disingenuous.
Ian, is the message about bullying, oppression and subjugation interpreted in China the same as what it's in, how it's interpreted in the Western media?
I can't speak for 1.4 billion people, but I can probably say there is a qualitative difference between the reception that it got and the kind of connotations that the phrase holds. Because I feel like and to jump off Professor Mahoney's point, I think it's totally accurate. And I would also say that the sort of reflexive dismissal of the idea of bullying is implicit in most of these headlines and the treatment, because their framing in their reporting tends to make China out to be some sort of bully or expansionist power. Now, again, ignoring the many, many times that she has talked about not wanting to be a hegemon or expansionist or imperialist, and the actions that reflect that point of view. Selectively choosing this particular phrase is in keeping with that kind of framing. So yes, I mean, in terms of saying no to bullying, oppression, and subjugation, there's a very raw nerve there, because China has had a very long history of being, going back more than 100 years in more recent history, before the CPC took power in 1949, of being oppressed, subjugated, and yes, bullied. And the Opium Wars, the attempt to create a market for addictive narcotics in China, and the occupation of its territory. This is a very recent trauma that holds strong power in the minds of many Chinese people. And so responding to that by saying it won't happen again, which is a very reasonable thing to say as a sovereign country, tends to strike a nerve consequently in the minds of those who would see China as a country that deserves subjugation and deserves this kind of treatment, that wants the continuity from the area of imperial occupation to continue now, which is implicit in a lot of the reporting that we see, not just here, but in many other areas.
Professor Mahoney, we do notice the difference in the Chinese version and the English version of the speech. For instance, in the Chinese version, it was using the Chinese expression, the four-word idiom of head being broken and blood being spilled, which is kind of a set phrase in Chinese. But in the English version, it was it was translated into to be on a collision course with a great wall of steel made up of 1.4 billion people. How do you look at the difference between these two versions, and the fact that the international press all use the original Chinese version instead of the English version that's meant to be sent as an official message from China?
Well, I think we often find that there are discrepancies in terms of literal translations of idioms or vernacular that don't fare well when they are translated directly. But I think it's also the case that President Xi was speaking in strong terms, and he sometimes does that, even though he did, as noted previously, caveat that with calls for cooperation. Again, to be honest with you, I find the original Chinese to be quite fair, given the incredible vitriolic comments we had coming out of the West, and misrepresentations, lies, slander that we've seen, that in many cases has verged on, accusing the Chinese government of, and Trump himself made these accusations, of deliberately fabricating a virus and attacking the United States. And these are I think these are the broader context that we have to look at. We might hear something that we find a little off-putting in the original Chinese, but when we compare it to the counter discourse, I think it's rather tame. And I think that President Xi Jinping understood that he needed to speak in strong terms to certainly certain parts of China who feel still very sensitive about this and want to hear that kind of strong language from their leader.
Ian, how do you read the perception of these messages, not just from the people on the Tiananmen Square that particular day, that particular moment, but also later as we see the kind of reaction from social media? What does that say about the sentiment among the Chinese general public toward the sense of injustice, in my eyes almost, that they have accumulated over the past few years, especially, right, under constant attack from some anti-China forces in the West?
Right. Well, I mean, this is the same sort of overall tenor of the criticism of the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, right? This notion that there is this new nationalistic strain of rhetoric among Chinese diplomats and officials. But let's keep in mind that if there are wolf warriors engaged in this battle of words, who started? Who were the first wolf warriors to do this? And it's of course people in the United States who are making these kinds of ridiculous accusations about China. You know, China has been under rhetorical attack for many, many years, even during the period of reform and opening up. You look back at the reporting that took place for that went on for previous leaders, even the so-called, you know, the people, Western media tries to pretend that this is a new trend, that they're responding to this new tenor. But the reality is, if you go back to any of the previous leaders, you'll see the same tropes being employed. So this has been going on for a very long time, and now, suddenly, when diplomats or officials respond and say, "Hey, this isn't fair," you know, here's why. This is why this is an incorrect thing to say. Suddenly, they're the wolf warriors. They're the ones taking on this new aggressive tone. But in reality, it's always been a defensive move. It's always been a response to the initial aggressions of other countries, especially the U.S. That's implicit in the metaphor that was used, because immediately followed up, even if you take that idiomatic phrase literally, it's clear because of the expression that follows, on a great bashed, you know, even if you say heads bashed and all that, on a great wall of steel, that means who's doing the aggressing here? Who is the one bashing her head? It's not, despite the attempt to spin this into an aggressive kind of rhetorical flourish, even in its literal translation, it is a defensive phrase. So this is a very deliberate attempt to twist words and make something that is defensive in nature appear aggressive and expansionist, and all the adjectives we've heard in recent years about China's so-called aggression.
Wang Cong, how do you look at the disconnect between the emphasis in his speech, in Xi's speech, versus the kind of key words that are taken out and focused on? For instance, as I mentioned, in his Chinese version, over 80 times the word people were mentioned, and then multiple times development mentioned, 25 times, rejuvenation 24 times, and yet, you know, the word bullying only mentioned 3 times, and yet these words pretty much got no coverage at all in some media outside.
Well, first of all, we have to take a look at who is the speech intended for. Obviously, on such a crucial day, a historical moment in Chinese history, I think the ultimate goal of the speech is for the 1.4 billion people in China. And President Xi strike a very positive, confident note of where we are today, of the challenges we face, of where we're going. And after that, I think nothing these Western media outlets write can dampen the mood of the Chinese people. Over the past several days, I've been talking to friends who were there at the square, who watched at home, people online. I think I've never seen this before. A country of 1.4 billion people, so energized, so full of pride and confidence, so looking forward to the future. Isn't that something we all need at this day and age with all that's going on around the world? Isn't that the responsibility of any efficient and responsible political party and government? I mean, as much as these Western media outlets are trying to make the whole thing about themselves by cherry picking one specific sentence, I think this is about a celebration for the entire Chinese nation. As much as they try to paint this as a proof of a assertive bullying China, I think this is about rallying a 1.4 billion people to pursue a better life. I think nothing they write, nothing they do is gonna stop that. As President Xi put it, China is on an unstoppable path towards great rejuvenation.
He was using the word historical inevitability, again, met with very strong emotions on the among the crowd. As I said, the word national rejuvenation was picked out by the New York Times, and the fact that this word was, this term was repeated some 20 times in the speech. Mr. Mahoney, Professor Mahoney, is this necessarily a threat in the eyes of some people? Does it really mean a demise of other nations if the Chinese nation is eventually rejuvenated?
Well, I think the answer is yes and no. Without question, it puts pressure on a country like the United States, which was a global superpower before the People's Republic of China was founded, and the sole superpower for the past 20 years. The US power and unilateralism now appears to be in steep decline. And this is a good thing in terms of global equity. It's also more the results of US overreach and poor strategic behavior, but American leaders find it doubly useful to blame China instead. First, to shift blame, and secondly, to mobilize if possible to meet this new challenge to American hegemony. Nevertheless, for many countries, although we risk some global frictions that could be quite dangerous, a rising China ought to be a good thing, as long as China does what it promises to do, avoids aggression and unilateralism in international affairs. Now, a simple example here are the millions in the developing world who are now benefiting from Chinese vaccines and other forms of assistance that they would not be receiving if China was not a rising and benevolent power.
Yes, action will definitely speak for itself, and it's for the world to see. Finally, there is a huge contrast among the, for instance, the New York Times coverage of the US's Independence Day celebration and the Chinese Communist Party's 100th anniversary celebration. It's very different as we can imagine. Ian, I want to go to you. How do you look at the kind of a disconnect? Is there a double standard, or what drives, the very different sentiment toward these very different events?
Of course, I mean, there is a double standard, and there's a certain blindness to one's own patriotism and one's own displays of nationalism, right? It's normal. It's normal in the U.S. for there to be military jets flying over every major sports game. It's normal for everyone to say the Pledge of Allegiance and sing the national anthem. These are highly normalized expressions of national pride that don't get looked at in any kind of critical way, the same way that they take a kind of an electron microscope to every celebration of Chinese history and Chinese patriotism. So, of course, there's a double standard. The question that we have to ask ourselves, and the question that I think is very important, is what is the difference, right? If there are two nationalisms, what do they represent? And I find that even if, again, we're taking this metaphor to be literally spilling blood in a defensive action against aggression, I think metaphorical blood is a lot better than literal actual blood. And we can think about what the actual real bloodshed and the real blood cost was for the US's rise and its continued dominance in the world, right? Thinking just in the last 20 years, potentially up to 1 million Iraqis killed, many others in the Middle East killed, many wars fought, many invasions and acts of aggression, real acts of aggression, not imagined potential hypothetical acts of aggression. We're talking about real people, real carnage. So for me, there is a stark difference in the celebration of a country's largely peaceful rise, a country that has not been at war in over 40 years, versus a country that has been at war constantly for, I believe, all but 20 some odd years of its existence. So there is a stark difference to me, and to look at one with rose-colored glasses and to look at one with an intense magnifying glass is, of course, the biggest double standard possible.
We have to leave it there. Many thanks for your insights. Ian Goodrum from China Daily, Professor Josef Mahoney from East China Normal University, and Wang Cong from Global Times. And on that thoughtful note, we're going to wrap up this special edition of Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Li Xin in Beijing. Thanks for watching.